Hello, dear listener. Welcome back to our series on connecting with youth and their realities. This is, as you may know, the second part of an earlier presentation, the whole teen concept. And the whole teen concept seeks to try to paint a holistic picture of teenagers. Of course, the thrust of it is connecting with youth and their realities. And these are some of the realities that we have shared earlier. We looked at basically a scripture from John 10, verse 14, where Jesus says, I'm the good shepherd. And he says, my sheep hears my voice and I know my sheep, and things like that. And we use that to establish a case that to be successful with teenagers, it is important to understand the styles in which they think and feel, so that we can shape our ministries to reach them. Or we can shape our parenting styles to as it were, nurture them onto a foundation that the Lord has given us grace to do. And basically, these series are just aimed at equipping, empowering you, making you see that the work you're doing is honored and is recognized by people like us who are on the field with your teenagers. So this is a support material. It's not exclusive in the sense that it's the only best thing on the block. No, this is just some recommended ideas that we have as a result of your permitting us to have interactions with your teenagers, especially those of you who are parents whose wards come in contact with us in the ministry of church and in schools and in public meetings that we have. So in this session, we're going to be looking at, the earlier session we looked at the descriptions and all the labels and all the things. We redefined them. We looked at the differences that exist between we adults and teenagers. And now we're going to look at the whole concept of needs of young people. The needs of young people. God created us with physical, soulish, and spiritual needs. Every human being has these. You have a physical need, you have a soulish need, and you have a spiritual need. A common denominator among all human beings is the fact that all of us have needs. That's very interesting. Adults have needs, children have needs, teenagers have needs, aged have needs, rich men have needs, poor men have needs. Educated people have needs, the uneducated have needs, working people have needs, the unemployed also have needs. So everybody has needs. Our bodies have needs ranging from a need for food, water, sleep, air, etc. And many more you can add. But we are more than just the body, as you can understand. Our unseen parts are the real persons. What eyes do not see are the real persons. Our soul and our spirit, which is unseen, similar to our body, have needs. Let's look at some of our soulish needs. And these will be the same soulish needs of teenagers. One, acceptance. Teenagers are, like I said in the earlier presentation, sometimes they go to a place they're treated as children. And they get upset when treated like children. And in another breath, when they go to a place, they're treated as adults. And sometimes they run away from being treated as adults. So like I said earlier, they are too old to be children and yet too young to be described as adults. So they are hanging in between. And that is what also creates the identity crisis, because they don't belong here nor there. And so now they've got to be helped to understand that they belong where they are. And that's what these series are all aimed at doing. Approval, for instance, is a critical thing. To be approved as a human being, to be approved as a person, to be approved as somebody worth being listened to. They also have needs like encouragement. They have a need for encouragement. They need to be encouraged to go on. We need some Barnabases in the country, some Barnabases in the home, some Barnabases in the church who would be sons and daughters of encouragement. They also have a need for support. They need to be assisted, not just financially, but also need to be supported emotionally. It's a soulish need that they have. They need support from others. They need affection. Love must be, directed towards them. They have a need for affection. They have a need for security. They need to feel safe. It's increasingly becoming a challenge when I speak to teenagers, and some of them dread the fact that by the time they are leaving home for school, whilst they were leaving for school, there was a problem between dad and mom, and therefore they weren't sure if they would come and meet dad and mom together again. Security is critical. They also have a need for respect. You see, and that's, for me, is a very critical one. To be respected as a human being. To be treated as a human being. To be respected as a person full of grace. A person who is worth attention. A person who ought to be listened to. A person who ought to be treated with dignity. They also need attention. And oftentimes, if they don't get the attention at home, they crave it outside. And when the outside attention becomes a substitute for homely attention, parent, you'll be losing your teenager. It's very, very critical. They also need comfort. They need to be comforted. Because sometimes there's pain in their heart. This morning I had to spend close to 15 minutes comforting somebody all the way in the western region whilst I'm in Greater Accra. Just praying forgiveness over her heart, because for 2-3 weeks now she's not being herself because she feels so downhearted. And she had no reason to be downhearted, and yet she was downhearted. And so teenagers sometimes also need comfort. Look around you. Is there anybody who needs comfort? Any teenager who needs to be comforted? Not only those who have lost a parent or an uncle or a brother or sister, but some need to be comforted. Then also appreciation. It's a soulish need. I spoke with one young lady and she was telling me, the only time I get attention is when I do the wrong thing. Dear leader, do your teenagers get attention when they do the right thing? Do they catch your eye? Like in Parliament, they say the speaker catches your eye. You catch the speaker's eye. Do your teenagers catch your eye when they do the right things? Or they only catch your eye when they do the wrong things? You've got to be able to look at them and say, I encourage you. I appreciate you for being my daughter. I appreciate you for being my son. Just as you expect them to also do and say, I appreciate you being my teacher. I appreciate you being my leader. I appreciate you being my dad or my mom. If I had an opportunity to choose somebody as a mom, I would choose you. We also need to say the same things. Of course, I'm not talking about flattery here, but I appreciate them when they do good things. Spiritually, they also have a need to communicate with God. Parent, you've been communicating to God on their behalf. That's good. You've been doing offerings on their behalf. That's good. But for how long can you do that? You've got to help them. Esther, Ruth, you can name them. Several of these young ladies. The young lady who lived with this gentleman, Naaman, the army officer who had leprosy. She still remembered that there was a prophet in Israel and directed Naaman to go there. That's a young girl who knows what God has done. Talk about Josiah, who became a king at a very tender age. You can talk about so many of them. Name them. And I'm sure you know the list. They also need freedom from guilt. Guilt. Sometimes by some of the actions they've engaged themselves in, there's guilt, which is haunting them. They also need to be free from shame. Sometimes when we are kids, there's this sense of shame that comes upon us so bad. When a young girl dresses, for instance, she's from the bathhouse and stands in the mirror for 10-15 minutes, she gets a name. And there's a sense of shame that comes associated with that kind of behavior from adults and from siblings. And so they begin feeling shy. Because you must remember that a teenager is conscious of themselves. And because they're conscious of themselves, any sense of shame is very disturbing. Of course, if they do the wrong thing, we tell them in the face, this is wrong. I'm not countenancing compromises here. That's not what I'm talking about, especially unhealthy compromises. They also need forgiveness. And for those of you who were told, S-H-A-M-E, shame, S-H-A-M-E, shame, S-H-A-M-E, shame, as a child, you know what that did to you. Not even as a teenager, but as a child. And you develop that sense of shame. Of course, we must be ashamed of things that we do wrong when we are found. That's not the kind of shame I'm talking about. Using body parts of a teenager to insult them, for instance, creates a dislike and a disgust in them towards those things that you use as references. They also need forgiveness. As a parent, can you forgive your son or your daughter if they did wrong? Unfortunately, what I've seen is that when parents do wrong things against God, they ask God for forgiveness umpteen times. Many, many, many times. They ask God, God forgive us, God forgive us, God forgive us. And God does forgive them. But let your teenager do a wrong thing. It's very difficult for them to forgive them. Dear friend, dear listener, they also need a clear conscience. They also need peace and love. And these are some of the needs that teenagers have. And I'm sure you listening can also identify with these needs. That when these needs in your life are met, you feel fulfilled and you feel that there's a sense of satisfaction. I then now would proceed to mention some of the general characteristics of needs so that we can understand. First and foremost, the needs that I mentioned are cross-cultural. In other words, Africans have these same physical needs, emotional needs, and spiritual needs as Americans, as Orientals, as Latinos, as, Anglos. It doesn't matter your skin color, whether yellow pigmentation or black pigmentation or blue pigmentation, whether you live in a hut, whether you live in a brick house, whether you live in a whatever. It doesn't matter. You may live in a skyscraper. We all have the same needs. You may be a person driving a car, or you may be somebody riding a truck. You still have these same needs. Needs cut across culture. Needs are also the same in all generations. Adam, Abraham, Mozart, Kwame Nkrumah, our late president, in fact, the founding father, or the hero of many of us, Kwame Nkrumah, the showboy as he was called. I mean, our own, His Excellency Kofi Annan. And our youth, they share one thing in common. And that is that they all have needs. They all have needs. And the same needs that these people had several years ago, the same needs exist today in our teenagers. Needs are not a 21st century phenomenon. It's something you must understand. It's not a new phenomenon. It's not a postmodern world phenomenon. It's been there prehistoric times, during the historic time, during the agrarian period, during pre-literate times, during the Industrial Revolution, post-industrial revolution, to the modernization of man, right down to the postmodern world. These needs are still the same. Except, of course, the intensities vary from one level of generation to the other. And that I must concede. Every person, including pastors and parents, have needs. And we all live with these needs. Also, needs are lifelong and continuous. In other words, in this life that we live, human needs cannot be met once and for all. So, you don't meet the need today and say that, oh, I've met the need and it's finished. In fact, a little bit of basic economics say that human needs are insatiable. So it means that the needs will still be there. Adults have the same needs as children. For instance, an octogenarian living in a nursing home has the same needs for attention as a 4-year-old child. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? So teenagers also have needs, just as you and I have needs. So we as adults don't have to create an impression that only teenagers have needs. But it's important to identify the needs of teenagers so that we can help them. As we run a need-oriented program, need-based strategy, need-based teaching, need-based, the need-based thing is what leads into life application. Because if you share a sermon that has no bearing on my needs, I mean, forgive me for laughing, but what am I going to do with that? We can not meet our own needs, and that is one characteristic of needs. No person in him or herself can meet his own need. Our needs are met directly or indirectly. Directly by the Creator and indirectly through his human vessels. Since everyone has a need or the other, we need each other to meet the needs in us. It is very important. And so the position I'm trying to create for us to understand is this, that teenagers have needs, yes. And these needs cannot be met by themselves. And that's why they need you as a dad or a mom, as a leader, as a pastor, as an elder, as a deacon, as a deaconess. They need you as a cell leader because they cannot by themselves meet their need. Otherwise, they will leave us an island. And no man is an island to themselves. So God will take those who are even lonely and place them in families. I just want to suggest a few needs that teenagers have. 7 of them. First one, they have a need for purpose. Not just information. Not just tenets. Not just a creed. Not just some doctrinal positions. Rather, they need a cause, a purpose. There must be a cause before them, like Ron Luce said that. We've got to give them a cause worth dying for. Young people need to have a purpose. Clear-cut purpose. There must be a reason for existence. In January, I found myself in the winter of Sweden, and I was alarmed by some statistics that was thrown out in the public. And it came out that 38.5% of young people believed that life was meaningless. Can you imagine the impact of that? And these were high school young people. And look at the percentage. It's frightening. And so young people need a purpose, a clearly defined purpose. And this purpose must be able to wield their fullest cooperation and commitment. And that is what they want to die for. I've seen child soldiers. I've seen young people in northern Uganda. I've been to Mozambique to see the war soldiers, kids who were recruited into the main front lines. And they were shooting and killing every object that was movable. I've seen young people in northern part of Africa. And some of the things that they can do in the Middle East, you can see some of the things that they do. I was privileged to work with some reformation programs for child soldiers. And I tell you, some of the things are scary. But these young boys were given a purpose, a cause to fight for, and be willing, if need be, die for. I was in South Africa a couple of years back and in recent times, and I was at the Hector Peterson Memorial Museum, where you see this, you remember the Soweto massacre? Where the young boy was shot dead in front of the students' riot, the students' agitations, fighting against Afrikaans to be used as a medium of language. And so we've got to give our young people a cause to die for, a cause that they must be willing to live for. Many people want to die for Jesus. That's a good thing. But let's give them a purpose that wields their fullest cooperation and commitment. We must assist these young people to gain a glaring direction and a vision for life. Life has meaning. Life has a purpose. And young people need a clearly defined purpose for their life. And that's the only way that they can be committed. So that's the first need that young people have today. Teenagers particularly. They need purpose in their life. Second need that I want to share with you. Young people have a need for praise. You must recognize and show appreciation for what they do, even if they fail. Unfortunately, we have a tendency of praising them for doing only the things that they succeed in. When they fail, we must learn to also show appreciation. Praise them for even attempting and failing. Because attempting and failing in itself is very important. What this would do is that it will boost up, their self-worth and confidence to dare for greater challenges. And one of the things that young people love is a challenge. If you tell them you can't do this, that's when they will prove you wrong. And they'll put all their energies to it. But remember to give them praise. Unfortunately, sometimes in the church, you hear a lot of negative comments about teenagers. I remember I went to a group and I said, what do you think of when you hear the word teenage? And everything they said was negative. Drug abuse, armed robbery, teenage pregnancy, insolence, violence, this, that. It's all negative. So, can't we see any positive thing in teenagers? We could. But how come always we become overly concentrated on the negative things? They need our praise. We need to praise them for the little things they do. Let us not assume that if we don't say anything, it doesn't hurt them. It does. It hurts so badly. If you live with somebody who doesn't appreciate you for the things you do, for sure, you will not be comforted. The third thing that I want to submit to you teenagers need in your ministry is preparation. They need to be prepared. Preparation. Many people have matured into life without adequate preparation. Hence the many strugglings today. An example is someone who hears the word of God